Welcome to another episode of me reading Queer Pedagogy so that you don't have to. If you're new here, I'm Melanie Bennett. I am just a parent. I am just an average citizen who has taken a special interest in reading school policies and academic literature or primary sources to do with the education system here in Canada, specifically Ontario, to learn about what the hell is going on in education. Today, I've decided to take a little look at Kevin Kumashiro. Kevin came onto my radar because I'd heard of him before, but specifically, I came across citations pointing to Kevin Kumashiro's work in the Affirming Toolkit for Ontario educators and also the survey preceding the toolkit. And I noticed in the Affirming Toolkit, there were things like Unlearning, relearning, anti-oppressive education. So Kevin Kumashiro is the originator of his own little theory called the theory of anti-oppressive education. How curious, I thought. What is that? When I did a little Google search, I noticed straight away that other people were putting forward frameworks for anti-oppressive education. One of those that caught my interest was actually that the ETFO, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, so a union for Ontario teachers, had a framework of anti-oppressive education. The more I read about this anti-oppressive education, the more I felt I needed to do a long-form video going through some of the ideas in this so-called theory. So without further ado, let's get into it. Kumashiro has written many papers on anti-oppressive education over the years, but I'm only going to be reading from one of those, his paper called Toward a Theory of Anti-Oppressive Education, published in 2000. And the reason I'm going to read from this one only is because it is the only one that's been cited in his work. And I want to make sure that what I'm sharing with you is actually relevant. This is actually where the ideas are coming from, rather than just pulling different papers that are trying to support my ideas from all over the place. So we're going to stay on track and we're going to stay with this one paper. And a final note before we start. The point isn't to go through the entire paper word for word. That's not the point. The point's to highlight some parts of it, and the hope is to encourage you to go read the paper for yourself. He actually has many other papers. He has many other books. He's got many podcast recordings online that you can go listen to. The point is also to maybe give you a bit of a flavor using my analysis, but maybe if you read the sources for yourself, you may come to different conclusions. And if that's the case, that would be great. More people discussing ideas is always better than fewer. So yeah, the point is to highlight some parts of it, give my personal analysis, and hopefully to awaken a bit of curiosity in the listener. Buckle up, because I'm going to do a lot of reading in this episode, but I assure you it has a point to it. Right, let's get straight into the text. Kumashiro writes, I should note, second approach to anti-oppressive education nonetheless has limitations. 1. The assumption that information and knowledge lead to empathy does not account for times when feelings do not reflect intention, and for that matter, when neither feelings nor intention gets played out in behavior. 2, even when empathy, is achieved, it could be argued that it simply reinforces the binary of us and them. As Britzman has argued, the expectation that information about the other leads to empathy is often based on the assumption that learning about them helps the student see that they are like us. In other words, learning about the other helps the student to see the self in the other. Such a perspective leaves the self-other binary intact and allows the self, i.e. the normative identities, to remain privileged. 3. Consequently, teaching about the other does not reinforce the privileged student to separate the normal from the self, i.e., to acknowledge and work against their own privileges. Teaching about the other does not necessarily illuminate, critique, or transform the processes by which the other is differentiated and subordinated to the norm. Okay, to start, we're talking about the other. We're talking about educating about the other. Who is the other and who are they not? And this is the first step towards social justice teaching, I guess you could call it. It's to become critically conscious. I'm going to describe that in a little bit more detail later on in this video. Here, Kumashiro is quoting Deborah Britzman. She's a critical pedagogue, and I think a queer pedagogue at OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. So this is a teacher college. This is the teacher college that hosts many of the Freirean, Palo-Freirean pedagogues, and who spawned a lot of this stuff in the education system in Canada. So I think it's important that he's quoting Britzman specifically when talking about the other. And what he's saying, quoting Britzman, is that it's not enough to teach kids that other people exist, that there are different religions, that there are different cultures or family types, because that creates, according to him, a self-other dynamic. So instead, it's much better to teach kids how they enable oppression because of their own immutable characteristics, so that they become actively engaged in dismantling this perceived oppression. Again, no inquiry about how this way of looking at the world could impact the mental health of young people. I didn't come across any of that in this paper or other papers and books that Kumashiro has written. He goes on to write, in sum, this second approach to challenging oppression, like the first, works against the marginalization, denigration, and harm of the other. However, while such efforts do help the other, they do not bring about structural and systemic change. They do not change the norm. So this is what queer theory does. It changes the norm, and Kumashiro is a queer theorist ultimately. And thus, they do not disrupt the process that differentiates the other from the norm. So that's what queer does. We need to see what is normal and what is not. In addition to the approaches that address otherness, approaches are needed that address normalcy. Approaches that work against the privileging of certain groups, the normalizing of certain identities, and that make visible these processes. Like I said, Kumashiro is essentially a queer pedagogue. So he did write this anti-oppressive method, and it is used for other things, other intersectional identities, but it's bringing it all together. And so the Trans-Affirming Toolkit is if you look at it, it incorporates all these other intersectional identities. But ultimately, it's done in the service of pushing queer pedagogy, identifying abnormal, identifying normal, who is othered, who is not, and attacking normal. And in my view, it's very important that Kumashiro's paper here, or Kumashiro generally, is identified as a reference all over the Trans-Affirming Toolkit, because this is the model to create a praxis against normal using this particular framework that is also intersectional, but ultimately queer in the sense that it's finding, well, what are the normal things? What is normalcy? How is normalcy privileged, and how may we attack it? I want to look a little bit more closely at the concept of other. The way Kumashiro conceptualizes the other in this particular text, in my opinion, comes from Simone de Beauvoir. She was a radical French feminist and Marxist who once suggested that in an ideal society, women would be forced to work by law. And in that way, the revolution, the socialist revolution, would be furthered. When postmodernists like Kevin Kumashiro bring up words like other, otherness, othering, they're not showcasing a pearl of wisdom, a pearl of postmodernist ingenuity. Rather, they're repeating the ideas of Simone de Beauvoir. And she maintained that female identities do not innately exist, but they're created by men, and they reduce women to the other sex. So fun fact, Simone de Beauvoir was married to Jean-Paul Sartre, who believed that society was inherently oppressive and destructive. I believe he wrote the preface to Fran Fanon's book about violent decolonization called The Wretched of the Earth. They must have been a real fun couple at parties. Let's get back to the text. Othering, but also unlearning. What one has previously learned is normal and normative. The thinking here is that privilege is often couched in other discourses. For example, as I noted earlier, the privilege of whiteness is often disguised as authenticity, and heterosexuality is often privileged as normalcy or morality. Thinking critically, then, involves recognizing this couching and masking of privilege, and teaching critically involves unmasking or making visible the privilege of certain identities and the invisibility of privilege. As well as quoting Britzman, Kumashiro here is quoting Henry Giroux, who is, I think, fairly well known as a critical pedagogue at this point. He brought in Paulo Freire, the inventor of critical pedagogy, to Canada to develop a Canadian-American version of his model that would appeal or apply to the North American market. What's being said here, quoting Britzman and Giroux, is that unlearning, in my opinion, is the first step in brainwashing. It's an important part of the anti-oppressive framework, really important. It's where teachers must first be indoctrinated into the cult of social justice so that they themselves can learn to sniff out all this hidden oppression. They call this awakening critical consciousness. This is Paulo Freire's Easter. It's the death of the hegemonic worldview, so the dominant worldview, and awakening towards social justice consciousness. It's just the cult of Marxism. James Lindsay wrote an excellent book called The Marxification of Education. Read it if you want to understand more about it. I'll touch a little bit on some of those topics, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I think it's very important to note that the Affirming Toolkit proudly has a chapter about unlearning called Unlearning, including a section on anti-oppressive education. I suspect Kumashiro knows what he's doing is destructive, but he believes that destroying what exists will bring forward a utopic future. So a future that is full of all this equity, where everybody has equal outcomes. It's this beautiful utopia of the future, this undefined utopia. I believe that he believes this, but to achieve that, we don't build on what we have. To achieve that, you must first destroy what already exists. And like any cult, before you can bring anyone else in, you yourself have to be a believer in whatever ideology that cult has. And so let's go back to the text. I should note that the process of learning about dynamics of oppression also involves learning about oneself. This is the self-reflexivity. Students need to learn two things about themselves. One, that some of their identities and experiences may be those they are studying about, and thus that they may be privileged in some ways. So the students need to learn that they could be enabling or the perpetuators of some of that privilege. How are the students doing this? How are they part of it? Two, that they often unknowingly are complicit with and even contribute to these forms of oppression when they participate in privileging of certain identities. Thus, teachers should engage in a pedagogy of positionality that engages both students and teacher in recognizing and critiquing how one is positioned and how one's position and how one positions others in social structures. The only way this works is if you believe in this idea of social justice, if you believe in this Marxist way of looking at the world, that people have privilege and power and all this stuff, that's the only way this works. So you have to believe in that to be able then to investigate your identity and which aspects of your identity that are revolved around sex, race, gender are perpetuating whatever forms of oppression. Like, you have to believe that. So the teachers need to believe that so that they can teach children to study how their own identity is part of this system, this Marxist worldview. This is raising the critical consciousness. Children are not taught critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy is done to them. So it is practiced on them. And this is a good example of it. The teacher must be versed in this mode of thinking so that they can apply the lens, the Marxist lens, teach children to also see the world through the Marxist lens. That's what this pedagogy of positionality is. If I haven't made it clear at this point, and I don't think I have, the reason I keep bringing up Marxism is simply because Paulo Freire, this is all based on Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire was a Marxist himself. It's highly quoted by Marxist thinkers, as we'll see. But the way of understanding the world through the victim, perpetuator, or oppressed, oppressor, that sort of worldview is rooted in Marxism. The idea is that you have to understand how you are being oppressed by the world and how you are oppressing others in the world based on collective identities, so that you can fight the system, to destroy the system, to have some perfect utopia or equity or equal outcomes in the future. This is at the core a Marxist lens of the world. That's why I keep bringing it up. Moving on. Schools, after all, are part of a society, and understanding oppression in schools requires examining the relationship between schools and other social institutions and cultural ideas. For example, understanding the marginalization of female students and faculty requires looking at not only the sexist interactions and cultures, but also patriarchal structures, as male-dominated administration with a female-dominated workforce. And such phallocentric, male or masculine-centered ideologies. I had a little look at what phallocentrism is. It's not male-centered or masculine-centered. It's, what is it? Wikipedia says, phallocentrism is the ideology that the phallus, or male sexual organ, is the central element in the organization of a social world. Okay. Are we worshipping the penis at school? Is that what he's saying? I mean, he's talking about patriarchal structures. The patriarchy is another Marxist feminist, basically a Marxist feminist invention. This idea that capitalism requires gender, which separates humans into categories where one of them, males, go do the work or go earn capital, and then women are forced to stay home to do the unpaid labor of raising the nuclear family. I mean, that's the patriarchy. So it's questionable whether or not that's even a thing, because we're not just talking about old family types. It's a Marxist concept that he's talking about here. And then he talks about phallocentricity, penis obsession, penis envy. I don't know. It sounds pretty Freudian to me. These people are mental. Similarly, understanding social and economic reproduction and oppression on the basis of class requires looking at structural factors, in particular at the imperatives and contradictions of capitalism, to see how such things in the commodification of culture, the paradoxical nature of working class resistance, and the technical control of teachers all contribute to legitimization and maintenance of the existing socioeconomic order. He could not be expressing a more Marxist lens or worldview or idea here. He's telling you this entire thing is about social reproduction, which I will explain in a minute. And he wants to use social reproduction theory to understand the oppression of queer students, requires moving beyond homophobia and its humanist psychological discourse of individual fear of homosexuality as contagion, to consider heteronormativity and how the production of deviancy is intimately tied to the very possibility of normalcy. So let's have a little look at what social reproduction is. In Marxist theory or philosophy, it's believed that in any society, the dominant culture always reproduces itself, sort of like genes, sort of like the selfish gene theory that genes have to perpetuate themselves, they have to reproduce themselves. It's the same with culture for a Marxist, that in a society, the dominant culture reproduces itself. Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci came up with the idea of using institutions like the education system to disrupt social reproduction. All that is a way of saying they are simply looking for a way to break the current society to make it Marxist. Kumashiro sure is a fan of citing Gramsci. He does throughout all of his work, and you can go look them up yourself. Another Canadian Marxist pedagogue that I covered, Peter McLaren, he was consumed with figuring out how to solve the problem of social reproduction through education, how to use the education system to demolish the current culture, what he calls neoliberalism, and to replace it with what he views as the utopic future, the equity of social justice, the Marxist future. Others of his contemporaries, people like Henry Giroux, Joe Kinchlow, Simon Roger, and Britzman too. These are all people who are at OISE or the McGill University in Montreal. Between all of them, they wrote extensively about how our current education system, the education system that we had before it became super socialist, okay, what they called the neoliberal education system. They call that as an insult, by the way, as they mean capitalism by that. So how that current education system reproduced counter-revolutionary capitalist world, right? So why was reproducing young people that were not becoming revolutionaries? They were counter-revolutionaries. They were against the communist desire to destroy, basically just destroy society. Why was that happening? They wanted to know that. What they did is that they blamed the liberal idea of merit-based education. They blamed that as the problem. So merit reproduces social injustice because it failed to create a society free from inequality where everyone had access to equal outcomes. That's equity. So nowadays we see in the education system equity everywhere. So they've managed to go around the problem of social reproduction by stopping the reproduction of merit-based education, knowledge acquisition education. They've broken that. They replaced it with equity, equal outcomes for all, or Marxism or communism, whatever you want to call it. So you could say that they used Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy as a blueprint for re-engineering the liberal merit-based system of education, what they call the neoliberal education, into a Marxist education that's designed to eliminate the production of future capitalists. If you're wondering at this point, why are we talking about all this Marxism and capitalism and social reproduction when we're talking about a model of education for students? We're talking K-12 students here. In fact, the ETFO, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, have an anti-oppressive model on their website or framework on their website. Why are we talking about all of this politics stuff? That's because education has become political. It's been taken over by people who view education as inherently political. Henry Giroux constantly was talking about how education is political. And so they want to drive the direction of that politics specifically. And all of this equity in schools is a drive towards far left radicalism. Very little is left at college, teacher college, that is anything else rather than this critical pedagogy. So teaching has become political. It's just been politically taken over by people who have very radical idea of what they want education to look like. So you have to ask yourself as a parent, if you're listening to this, did I consent? Even if I'm left-leaning, even if I have Marxist sympathies myself, because, there are Marxists who are not intersectional. If I am an NDP voter, do I actually want my K-12, my kids in grade 3, do I actually want them to be radicalized politically at school? So we have to ask ourselves those questions because it's happening whether we want it or not. This is just what's going on. I'm sharing with you the direction that education has taken because I'm following the citations of people putting toolkits and resources in schools. Then the unions are backing them to make sure that they teach this. All teachers' unions are pushing DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, which is this stuff. It's all similar. It all comes from the same thing. It all comes from a radical far left position of politicizing education. So we have to ask ourselves, Did we ask for this? I don't remember asking for this. In fact, people are starting to get kind of annoyed at me for pointing out that this is what's going on. Anyway, a bit of a sidebar. Let's get back to the text. On the theme of education is inherently political, researchers have also noted that schools do not stand alone of these structures and ideologies, innocent of the dynamics of oppression, but are institutions or apparatuses that transmit ruling ideologies, maintain hegemony, which is a Gramsci thing, and reproduce existing social order. Researchers have argued that school and other social institutions serve two functions. They privilege certain groups and identities in society while marginalizing others. And they legitimize this order by couching it in the language of normalcy. This is the queer pedagogy angle here. So we need to identify what is normal so that we can put it in the class of hegemony or dominant, right? So hegemony, dominant, normalcy, they're all kind of grouped together as the form of oppression. And he also has common sense in little quotes. Thus, the role of school in working against oppression must involve not only a critique of structural and ideological forces, but also a movement against its own complicity in oppression. So it's not enough to be aware of the oppression, you must act against it. As I mentioned earlier, Antonio Gramsci came up with a model of a passive revolution, what he later called the Long March through the Institutions, or was known as the Long March through the Institutions. So this is the hypothesis that one can overthrow an existing capitalist, neoliberal, democratic order by subverting its institutions one by one. Gramsci and Marxists are, what we understand today, laid down the model for a kind of cultural revolution. What Kumashiro is doing here is telling you that he believes school, so the school system, exists as a vehicle to attack the ruling ideology or the hegemony or normalcy. So this is the liberal education, so merit-based education, knowledge acquisition education. And he wants to replace it with Marxist education, or his theory of anti-oppressive education, by attacking the very idea of normal and common sense. Here in Canada, the evidence is all around us that educators are deliberately undermining the stability of normal and common sense. Everywhere you look, you can see it, but you can trace it back to this document or these ideas. And the idea is to create a state of instability, and that's called queer. And that's framed as an oppressed category requiring kid gloves and special status to uplift it. But all queer means, I made a video on what is a queer child. I urge you to go watch it if you haven't already. It sort of goes into the meaning of queer and why queer is not an identity. In fact, it is the opposite of an identity. But he wants to frame normal as this bad thing so that we can elevate queer, which is a political opposition to that normalcy. It is a Marxist praxis. Is it a means of attacking the hegemony that Gramsci talked about? Thus far, I've argued that teaching students to be critical of oppression entails helping them recognize both the privilege of certain identities, including their own. So those kids, they need to know that they're complicit in oppression, and the processes of normalizing. So anything that's normal. So heterosexuality would be viewed as normal and normal is bad, and othering. So whatever they view as not normal, because that's where it's really coming from, their own analysis of normal and not normal, as othered, in which they are complicit. So kids need to be told that look, you're complicit. It's your fault too, you know. You're just a kid, you're just 12, but you are complicit in these systems of oppression holding people back in life. This third approach to bringing about change, however, does not have as its sole goal knowledge about oppression. As I argued earlier, critical education involves both the critique and transformation, so transformation towards Marxism, of structural oppression. Knowledge is but the first step of a larger process. So becoming aware or becoming critically conscious is just the start. Also necessary are thinking skills that students can use to formulate effective plans of action. So you must once you're aware, you must be given the skills to act against the oppression, act against the system, act to break the hegemony. Ellsworth describes the assumption underlying critical pedagogy that the teaching of analytical and critical skills, so these are critical of the system, by the way, analyzing and critiquing the system for oppression, for judging the truth and merit of propositions, and interrogation and selective appropriation of potentially transformative moments in the dominant culture. So this critique is really, how do we critique the dominant culture? It's not, is this good? It's not, is viewing the world in this way a good thing? Or are there other alternatives to approaching things that might be unfair? There's none of that. We're not actually doing critical thinking. We're doing critical in the critically conscious sense that we are becoming awakened to the Marxist worldview, and we're applying that lens, and we're being self-reflexive of our own complicity so that we can become Marxist revolutionaries and destroy the system. I mean, it's very anarchistic in this sort of way, but using Gramsci's model of using the institution to get people to view the world in this way. Thus, when students have both knowledge about oppression and critical thinking skills, they will be empowered to challenge oppression. In other words, when students are taught to view the world from a Marxist perspective and told that what they can do to address it, which is apply Marxist destruction, basically, of capitalism, then they'll be empowered to challenge oppression. Well, they're just empowered to destroy the system because they're not empowered to build anything. We're not asking, how can we build on what we know? We're not asking, well, what's good about the system? What's bad about it? We're just saying it's all bad, and how do we destroy it? In a roundabout way, what I'm saying here is Kumashiro, Giroux, McLaren, all of these people, they're solving the problem of social reproduction. Remember the idea that societies will reproduce the dominant system, and in their eyes, that's so-called capitalism, right? So capitalism is reproducing itself. But they solved that problem by going into the K-12 education system and applying anti-oppressive education, which is critical pedagogy. It's a means of politically brainwashing, politically grooming young people from the very beginning at school to view the world through a Marxist lens, to become critically conscious so that they can act against the so-called system of capitalism. They've solved the problem of social reproduction by going into school. So I'm going to ask again, do you remember giving your consent? If you're a parent with kids in school, did you give your consent to this? And not only that, if you've raised concerns with your teachers, your school principal, your school board, whatever, even the Ministry of Education, if you've raised any concerns, have you been treated fairly? Have you been listened to? Or have you been called a right-wing extremist, a bigot, a transphobe, whatever it is that they call you? Because there's a lack of transparency of what this actually is. And these ideologues are speaking to themselves, and it's fine that you can share these things if you believe in the cult. But if you're someone who's critiquing it, who doesn't agree with it, but is understanding it, they don't like that. So there's a lack of honesty. There's a lack of transparency, and there's most certainly a lack of consent seeking, broad consent seeking from the public. So we need to address these issues very, very, very urgently. Okay, let's go back to the text. As Freire, whose work on liberatory education has become the foundation of critical pedagogy, and feminist researchers influenced by him, Hooks, Wheeler, have argued critical education, or consciousness raising, what Freire calls conscientization, entails learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions, and to take action against the oppressive elements of reality. That's interesting, the oppressive elements of reality. Similarly, Mayer and Tétrault have argued that if the classroom setting can help students to understand the workings of positional dynamics in their lives, then they can begin to challenge them and create change. That's a lot of responsibility to put on the backs of kids, to make them responsible for enacting change through telling them that they're responsible for oppression. That seems remarkably similar to what we're not supposed to do as parents, parentifying the child. But these are not parents, so we'll call it adultifying children. So telling them about these things in the world that they have no control over, telling them that they're complicit in all of these horrible things about the world, and it's their job to create change. Isn't that adultifying? Isn't that putting children in the position of adults when they're not mature or ready enough to understand it? That's child abuse. Thus, critical knowledge and thinking is what impels students towards action and change, toward resisting and challenging oppression, not their responsibility. This emphasis on knowledge and resistance is characteristically not only of many critical and feminist pedagogies, but also of queer and multicultural pedagogies, who advocate a critical and resistance multiculturalism, who advocate for social reconstructionists. This is just not the responsibility of young people, not even in the slightest. So why are we doing it? These methods, they're Freirean. So it's about awakening students to oppression. So opening their eyes to all this oppression all around them. Don't forget, Freire's method was actually devised for adults, not kids. And the point is for them to become critically conscious. It's not to help them learn better. It's so that they act against the system. That's the point. Please explain to me that this is not brainwashing. Please give me an argument for why this is not brainwashing, because to me, that seems very much like brainwashing, taking the immature mind of young people who are already inclined towards fairness, but not mature enough to understand the intricacies of life, to tell them that they have this responsibility to fight all this oppression, that they also may be complicit in it by creating a state of mental crisis. How is this not brainwashing? How is this not child abuse? I haven't even touched on whether or not this oppression even exists. It's just being framed as that. So we're just going on the assumption that this oppression exists and the kids must fight it. But never mind. Let's go back to the text. Rather, the goal is to is a change informed by these theories of anti-oppression, a change that works against oppression. Again, is it really oppression? We're not investigating that at all. It just is. We're saying that it is. Often, this change does not come easily, which leads to the second insight from feminist queer readings of psychoanalysis. Anti-oppressive education involves crisis. It involves crisis. Earlier, I critiqued critical pedagogy for its reliance on rationality. Oh my God, we don't want to think rationally. We don't want common sense. That is dumb. Talking about one's own experience with and complicity in oppression, whether this oppression is real or not, we don't know. Perhaps most importantly, learning things that force one to relearn or unlearn what one previously learned cannot always be done rationally. Drawing on the work of Feldman, I argue that learning about oppression and unlearning one's worldview, so brainwashing yourself to view the world through the Marxist lens, can be upsetting. Of course it can be upsetting. Brainwashing is upsetting. Cognitive dissonance is upsetting and paralyzing to students because, they're kids, they're minors. We're talking K to 12 here. And thus can lead them to what I call a paradoxical condition of learning and unlearning. Students can simultaneously become both unstuck, distanced from the way they've always been taught, no longer so complicit with oppression, and stuck, intellectually paralyzed so that they need to work through feelings and thoughts before moving on to a more academic part of the lesson. He's deliberately causing a state of crisis because that is a desirable thing to do so that he can get them to unlearn what their families have taught them, unlearn all the things that they, all the way that they understood the world, to relearn it in the direction of social justice. This is brainwashing. Through paradoxical and in some ways traumatic, this condition should be expected by teaching students that the very ways in which we think and do things can be oppressive. So your very existence, the very way you exist and think and do things, that in itself is oppression. Teachers should expect their students to get upset. So he's preparing teachers to deliberately upset kids, to cause trauma, to tell them that they are the mere ways in which they are existing in the world, the mere ways, even their thoughts are oppression. This is unbelievable. And this anti-oppressive model of education is the foundation for the trans-affirming toolkit, which is all over Ontario right now, and the ETFO, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, have a whole framework for anti-oppression education. Loads of anti-oppression frameworks exist all over Canada. But if you read the original research, the drivers, the authors of these so-called theories, which is really just a set of ideas, it's brainwashing. How can you even look at it any other way? Not just brainwashing. I actually believe that what I've just read, what I've just described, is called trauma bonding. And as far as I know, many, many cults have used trauma bonding, right? It's like getting people to go through this cognitive dissonance when they're vulnerable and then reprogramming them in their minds in the direction that they want to lead them. Like, this is a known cult brainwashing technique. It's also used by people who may have predatorial predilections. I know it's couched in, I don't know, fancy postmodernist or Marxist type language to make it seem like it's about social justice and make it seem like it's about helping the marginalized. But the methodology here is a deliberate brainwashing technique to get people to do and behave in the way that you want them to. So what happens after teachers have set up this deliberate state of crisis? Consequently, educators need to create a space in their curriculum for students to work through this crisis. May that be the safe space? Phallocentrism discusses how her students worked through crisis they experienced in giving testimonies, i.e. revisiting in different ways. So let's go over the traumatic experience in lots of different ways. She argues that teaching and learning really take place only through entering and working through crisis. So we can only really learn by entering this really uncomfortable space where you're supposedly learning that you're part of this system of oppression that's keeping all these people down, right? So you can only learn through that and work through it with the teacher who's guiding you in the direction of social justice. In this process that moves a student to a different intellectual, emotional, and political space. So your teacher is guiding you in the direction they want you to go. In noting that both teaching and psychoanalysis involve living through crisis, she explains that they both are called upon to be performative and not just cognitive, insofar as they both strive to produce and enable change. So they're striving to produce a desired change, the change that in the direction of social justice, aka Marxism. Both are interested not merely in new information, but primarily in the capacity of their recipients to transform themselves in function of the newness of that information. So to transform is unlearn what you knew before, develop a Marxist worldview, and transform that into action against the system. This is very petulant. This is very teenage. I mean, the tactics are downright evil, but it feels to me like most of this Marxist stuff is just like a teenage tantrum that life isn't fair. But I'm not actually going to build something. I'm not actually going to do something positive with broad consensus and collaboration with people that of all different orientations. No, I'm just going to tear it down. It's very, very, very teenage. In revisiting the crisis through testimony, students are not merely repeating the crisis, but supplementing it, giving it new readings, new meaning, and new associations. This is not unlike the way in which many students supplemented the stereotypes when they wrote and performed a skit, blah, 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 blah. I honestly don't know how else to read Kumashiro as just a blueprint for brainwashing and child abuse. I would love if someone, again, with a psychological background could tell me if maybe I'm being a little overly worried here, because I would like to be reassured that it's not as I'm actually reading it. But what I'm reading is not great. So yeah, if you have some knowledge, please write it in the comments. I'd love to hear about it. There's a lot more going on in this paper, but I think I've read enough to give you a flavor of what anti-oppressive education really is. It's not just a fancy word for equity education. It's not just a fancy word for social justice education. It's its own map on how to deliver or to encourage kids to view the world through a Marxist lens. If you're interested in my analysis, I would highly encourage you to go find these papers, read them for yourself, and see if you agree with my analysis. Maybe you disagree. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd like to turn our attention away from the text right now, and I want to look at who the hell is Kevin, and is he okay? I tried to watch a lot of Kevin's videos where he gives presentations to get a feel for what he's like. I sometimes like to watch presentations from authors when they're available after I've read their work. And I found something curious with Kevin. He has a very affable public face, whilst at the same time sometimes can be very, very radical when he thinks he's just speaking intimately to a group of his peers. So let's watch this contrast in video.
You know, I think about how people sometimes wonder aloud whether they have a role to play if they are very different from, let's say, the children or the youth that they're teaching. And of course, my answer is yes, we need people from one's community and people from outside, because part of, I think, our role modeling is showing how we navigate the spaces we're in and the backgrounds we bring and how we leverage those, right? It's not just how we flourished in them, it's how we leverage them to make a certain kind of impact, right? It's like within higher ed, you could say I am in one of the most privileged institutions in one of the most privileged professions in the world, which is private university higher education in the United States. No question. But what that means is that I have a responsibility to leverage the resources of this institution to have the kind of impact in movement building that I wouldn't be able to have if I were anyplace else. And I would say that the same thing applies to everyone else. Everyone else is coming from a unique context. And our responsibility isn't to apologize as if we're trying to do away with that uniqueness, but to leverage it because it has something to add to the conversation.
And let's add to that even more. This is a profession that historically is defined by colonialism, by heteropatriarchy. I think of the great work of the scholar Erica Miners, who talks about the role of teaching, how the symbol of the teacher was a highly racialized, gendered image, right, that embodied this colonizing heteropatriarchal role that schools were supposed to be serving. And it's not surprising then, with this as the history, we create policies that compel a white female teaching force through racialized gendered policies, practices, and cultural norms. This is the teacher shortage. It is a combination of all of this, of capitalism, of demographic changes, of deprofessionalization, of the demonizing of teachers, of neoliberalism, of colonialism, of heteropatriarchy. And if you focus on only one aspect of the problem, you're not getting at the full picture, and there's no way you can get at a better solution.
I'm thinking I might do a commentary video analysis of a longer clip I have of Kevin Kumashiro describing his method. I think the video is about 2 years old. If you're interested in a video commentary, listening to Kevin speak in his own words, me maybe unpicking a little bit about his, he calls it a theory, unpicking his theory of anti-oppressive education, let me know in the comments. In conclusion, queer pedagogy definitely has Marxist roots. Its elements are formulated almost entirely in Freirean pedagogy of critical consciousness. And it's underpinned by many Canadian critical pedagogues, people like, Henry Giroux is American, but you get the drift, McLaren, Britzman. It's not entirely an American phenomenon. The methods that Kumashiro uses could easily be compared to cult or predatorial brainwashing techniques. And yet these methods, these anti-oppressive education methods, are specifically named in documents for K-12 education in Canada, including the Trans-Affirming Toolkit, but also PD documents from unions like the ETFO. It seems pretty clear if you read through it that the so-called theory is just repackaged language that appeals to the typical progressive liberal, people who consider themselves liberal, who don't necessarily understand that what they're doing is pushing radical Marxist ideology to their students. The ones that do understand and speak plainly about it are often teachers who have been struggled when they've mentioned anything, so struggled within their own schools. They've been or fired. So you have teachers like Chanel Fall, you have teachers like Jim McMurtry, Carolyn Borzowski. So many teachers have received many, many consequences for blatantly saying, look, this is Marxist indoctrination in schools. We don't agree with it. We don't think it's a good idea. Anyone opposing what's going on is immediately labeled as being so-called far right. Whether they're even on the right or not doesn't even matter. They don't define what far right is. I've made a video explaining what I believe the far right really means, and that's anyone who disagrees with us, generally speaking. But people get labeled. There's no discussion. We're not allowed to actually engage with these ideas, but in a way that's criticizing them. We can't deconstruct. We can't have a different opinion. A parent who wants to actually discuss this is treated like some kind of Nazi. These are problems. If we can't engage, if people we live in a pluralistic society, there's lots of different kinds of people. It's not just the far right is on the rise and they're all going to attack us and all these Nazis are going to put us in concentration camps. Like, that's the impression that's getting put out. But the reality is we live in a world where there's lots of different people. There are religious people. There are secular people. There are lots of different ethnicities. There's lots of different cultures in Canada. Not all of them are going to be interested in sending their schools to far left radical schools. They're just not. I've personally observed a lot of firsthand experience that the pedagogues pushing this, the critical pedagogues, the queer pedagogues, they're not encouraging future teacher students. So those who are learning to be future teachers, those students, they're not teaching them the theory or the origins of the theory behind what they're pushing. They're just pushing the idea that this is for fairness. So there's lies from the very get-go. And so all these future teachers who are already inclined probably towards empathy are thinking that they're doing is to help the poor marginalized, but they don't realize, or maybe they do, who knows if they do realize or not, but I've spoken to a lot of them that didn't even realize that the origins of their own theory, their own educational theory, philosophy, the things that underpin the methods that they were taught, they had no idea it was Marxist. And so when I pointed out to them, these people calling themselves Marxist in their own books, developing pedagogy for the future teachers to use, they've been flabbergasted. So there's many teachers who don't actually understand what they're doing is a far left praxis for communism. So somehow we need to find a way to get that message clear. Ask the teacher, do you really want to participate in a communist revolution? Is that what you're really trying to do? And frankly, lastly, if educators are not interested in engaging in the theory behind what it is that they're doing, if they're not willing to engage with that in a good faith way with a broad group of differing people with different opinions that are going to be different to their own, if they're not willing to do that, we need to start asking, are these the kind of people that we want teaching our children, who are so intolerant that they cannot listen to any other viewpoint but their own? I have a real issue here. I think we need, and I'm going to keep advocating for this, transparency. We need honesty. And we need to be able to have people with different perspectives that can actually have productive conversations in good faith without flinging shit across the room and accusing people of all kinds of different things. Without that, I just don't understand how we're supposed to have a public education system. This was probably why so many parents have started advocating for, charter school or vouchers, this, that, whatever. I'm not advocating for that necessarily, but there's a reason why people are doing that now, because they're not being heard. We have an education system that is full of educators who believe that what they're doing is righteous, correct, and anyone else who doesn't agree is uneducated, is a dum-dum. They don't know what they're talking about. They're the far right, or they're just indoctrinated into whatever it is that there's a lot of accusation and not a lot of engagement. So I'm going to keep advocating for engagement. I'm going to keep shining a light, and I'm going to keep showing in their own words, with their own documents, What is going on? It's time that we have open communication and conversations. Anyway, if this was useful, if you got something out of it, please feel free to leave a comment. I love to hear what people have to say. Like, subscribe, you know the drill, and I will see you in the next one.